Claire sort of drafted a title for this, which was How to Stay Calm and Influence, especially when you're angry. Sorry, ends up. I actually think this is about how to make friends and influence people. As a trans man who transitioned in 1975, I realised I was about the most disrespectful, unrespectful, I'm sure I've not used the right descriptor there, but the most, how I used to describe it was that we were the dog shit that people wiped off their shoes when they entered the property. We were sex perverts, and I always used to say I don't mind being a sex pervert, but I'd like to have the sex so I know how to pervert it. And that's one of my very old jokes, which probably still stands to this day. But finding a voice, finding my voice, becoming respectable, actually being able to say something about why the world needed to change was not something I ever imagined I was going to be able to do when I left school. Becoming, I call it becoming respectable, because to be listened to, you have to be seen as some sort of equal with other people. And to be seen as an equal with other people, you have to see yourself as an equal, first and foremost. That you have something valuable to contribute. That you have some way of doing that. When Sarah and I started, we became involved with Press for Change, which was founded by a group of us. It was the lobby group and campaign group for trans people's rights, which sought respect and equality. Back in 1992, we'd had the first of our children. And what we'd had to fight all the way to the doors of the court for the right for Sarah to use a fertility clinic that was licensed in order to become pregnant. The argument was, I'll paraphrase the letter, was, dear Miss Rutherford, we will never consider you a good enough woman to become a potential mother whilst you still live with him. And you know, there's that realisation. I had just completed a law degree when this happened, and I always say it was the day I became a lawyer. The day I realised that I had the skills and the knowledge. You know, I wasn't going to become a practising solicitor. The idea of ever going into an office again, I'd been in financial management at one point in my life. I was not going back into an office. But to realise that I actually had the skills to find out whether we could challenge the decision that they'd made, to find out how we could challenge that decision, to find out how we were going to argue it in court, to the point where the barrister walked out before it even started and said, yeah, she can start tomorrow. Was, you know, it was a huge change in my life to realise I had the ability to say something. I mean, I'd gone to a good school, I'd done well, but I was the weird kid, the really weird kid. I want to start off by talking about choosing your battles. There are things that do you know, the worst thing of this is I'm used to having my presentation here where I can see what I'm going to do next, and suddenly you get something new and you think, did I do that? But choosing your battles, and I'm going to talk about this. I'm not here to fight about bathrooms. This is a very recent issue. Sarah McBride, the first trans person, a trans woman, to be elected to Congress, has faced the challenges of the Republican Party, and in particular Nancy Mace, who has drafted a bill to ban members, officers and employees of the House from using single-sex facilities other than those corresponding to their biological sex. The bill is dreadful. How she defines biological sex is non-existent. People with intersex conditions would not know where the hell to pee. She now wants to extend this to all federal buildings, which means that if I arrive in New York, John F. Kennedy Airport, and want to go to the loo, I could be in trouble, you know. And that's quite frightening. You know, the prospect of, I remember being ill in John F. Kennedy Airport, having come off a plane being ill, and it was a very nice police officer who realised I was ill, not drunk. I did point out I'd not drunk anything on the plane, you know, I was ill. But there was that huge, monumental fear that as a trans man, I was going to face the potential of being taken to a cell and searched, and all the consequences of that. In fact, only a week ago, my wife said to me, well, we're not going to the States for that road trip any longer. And I said, yeah, sure we can. And she said, no, we are not. You know, I don't want to have to deal with that. That's something I have to respect. I think I can deal with it, but I understand that she would say, no, she can't deal with it. Nancy May said about Sarah McBride, you know, I don't want this person in my toilet because it's offensive that a man in a skirt thinks that he's my equal. You know, this is... Sarah's been transitioned a very long time, but the Republicans, we knew this was coming. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, ACO, says what Nancy Mace is doing is endangering all women and girls. If you ask them what is your plan on how to enforce this, they won't come up with an answer. There is an organisation they have called GenSpec. I always call it the genital inspectors, because I'm sure that's what they want to be. As Alexandria says, it inevitably results in women and girls who are primed for assault, because people are going to want to check their private parts and suspecting who is trans and who is cis. And of course, what's happened both here and in the States is that we have seen a very few cases of trans women being challenged, but we've seen quite a lot of cases of women who are not conventionally feminine being challenged. Right. LPAC, which supports people who are in the lesbian and trans, supports women particularly for elections, says if this was truly about creating safe spaces for women, why is it the more of an uproar about the fact that a man found liable of sexual abuse is our president, and that several of his high-level appointees have been accused? Of course, how do you deal with that? Well, Sarah McBride said, and she's taken a lot of flack for this from people in the trans community, I'm not here to fight about bathrooms. I will follow the rules as outlined, even if I disagree with them. I look forward to getting to know my future colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Each of us was sent here because voters saw in us something that they value. I look forward to seeing those qualities in every member come January. I hope all my colleagues will seek to do the same with me. I agree with Sarah. She's not actually there to fight about bathrooms. Bathrooms may well fall somewhere in her remit, but she's actually there to fight for Delawareans and their rights. But it's a very difficult issue, because how do you deal with the Nancy Maces of this world? Learning to listen is one of the most important skills you could ever get in negotiation. It's not about what you say often, it's about the notes you've taken. Too many people sit in negotiations and they don't have a notepad with them. They don't stop and listen and write down the questions that come up or the points that they disagree with. They think they're going to remember it all, but you're not. You know, even in workplace negotiations, when you're dealing with, you know, the person who's written some dreadful email to the entire staff about their particular line manager, and, you know, you think, oh, that was a really silly thing to do. Do you want to keep your job or not? Oh, you want to keep it? Okay, so we've got to deal with that. But they go in, they don't have anything to write anything down on, they think they're going to remember it all, they will miss half of it. Listening is one of the most important skills that you can do. Listening to the other side and actually deciding what you're there for is actually to seek improvement for all. We often go presenting our side. But I sometimes think that it's very important when we're in the room that we stop having sides. And if you can be the person who's the grown-up in the room who decides not to have the sides, but to actually think, how can we all get out of this bloody awful mess with a smile on our face and everybody doing well, that's the key thing. Learning to listen, for me, became really important. I'm really good at talking to people. I was born articulate and able, vaccinated with a gramophone needle, according to my mother. But at 18, I was that person who knew they were trans, but didn't think they were ever going to get anything for being trans, because it only did it to other people going the other way, you know. I didn't fit in with the lesbian community. You know, I tried that and it was a disaster. I didn't fit in with the straight community. Tried that, was a disaster. I was a bisexual trans man who was still living in a female persona. And I realised I just didn't know how to be. My ADHD and autism was rife, you know, as I've learned in later life to control them. But, you know, I didn't know how to be. I couldn't mask my difference any longer. I couldn't pretend to be the person that I wasn't. So I spent a year when I was 18 when I decided to stop speaking. To carry on life, to still go to the climbing club, to still go to the lesbian meetings, to still go out to gay bars, but actually to stop and listen. And I wanted to find out how other people led their lives. How did other people talk to each other? How did other people get on? I realised actually most of us were pretty crap at it. You know, and I was not much crapper than everybody else, but I had certain issues. I didn't listen properly was one of them, because I was always too busy thinking about what I was going to say. How did I respond? How did I deal with it? How did I answer the question? How did I participate? I was always thinking ahead instead of stopping and listening. And I think throughout life, the learning to listen has been a really important skill that I gained at that young age by taking time out to do it. And I honestly think that if you're a person who thinks, you know, I'm not listening enough, we had it in the last session down here, practice makes perfect. My practice was to spend a year deciding not to speak, unless I absolutely had to. It was great, actually. Had more sex than I'd ever had before. Yeah, and at 18 that matters. And I realised I wasn't that dislikable. What I had to do was find a way to A, like myself, to be myself, and to shut up sometimes, you know. Active listening, you can define this all over the internet. There's masses of stuff on being an active listener, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves what it means. It's about giving your full attention to the other person, not yourself. Stop thinking about what you're going to say in response. Listen. Listen more than you speak. Genuinely ask open questions about their ideas and their viewpoints. Saying to somebody, how do you think we should resolve this? Is a really good way of making them think of what they might contribute to the conversation that you're having. And genuinely stop and listen. Ask those questions. If needs be, clarify them. Make it clear that you don't understand their perspective. Perhaps you can explain it to me more. Perhaps you can, in my case, find myself saying, perhaps you can tell me why you think that a trans woman using the ladies' loo is going to endanger women, because then we can have a conversation about it. Don't just say it, give me the reasons why. You know, it's almost like, I remember, you know, I'm a lawyer, university researcher. You know, you don't answer questions without doing the research. So if anybody answers me a question, they can't give me the reasons, they haven't done their homework yet. And they need to go and do it. And always defer judgment. You know, it's amazing what you can learn from other people. Learning to listen and then think, yeah, you know, they've got a point there, is really sometimes extremely important. Don't interrupt them, allow them, and remember, every single person you speak to can't suddenly think on the spot. I can't think on the spot. I can't suddenly go, oh yes, I've got an answer here. I know exactly what I want to say, like I used to think when I was 18. Give them time to think through their answers. Give yourself enough time for meetings, but also time limit them. You know, we're having a meeting, we're here to discuss the following, it's going to be 30 minutes. At 30 minutes we're going to end. We'll decide then whether to call the meeting a second time to carry on the issues. Give a reasonable amount of time. Don't expect people to have instant answers, and allow people time to ruminate. Rumination is a really important thing. You know, after you go and be a hamster in a wheel and ruminate for a while. For about 10 years, I was the scheduler for the law school. Our sickness levels were very high. Our staff failure to inform when they weren't going to be in, or not tell students in sufficient time that they weren't going to give lectures, was causing huge problems. And the person who did the scheduling sort of gave up, retired, and 1 August they said, oh, we haven't got anything for September. And I stupidly put my hand up. Mostly because I love, you know, Excel spreadsheets. I started life as a, you know, a scientist who became a geographer who became a lawyer. So, you know, I still love Excel spreadsheets. But one of the things was, with 85 members of staff, you know, something like 14 different courses, overall nearly 3,000 students, I think it's 3,500 students we had coming in, there was a lot of scheduling in what was 17 rooms. You know, and so the first thing I did was I spoke to everybody. I sat down and said, what's going on in your life that means if I give you something at 8 o'clock in the morning, you can't do it, or if I give you something at 8 o'clock at night, you can't do it. And I got people to fill in graphs, and they were really clear, because by knowing that that person had an elderly mother that they saw 5 nights a week and they had to leave at 4, meant they would come in at 8 on one morning to do something. We weren't going to ask everybody to come in at 8, but I needed a few people to. And similarly, there were people who I needed to work at 9 o'clock at night. I used to have these conversations twice a year with members of staff to update where their lives were. Took 20 minutes each time. They'd fill in the little chart which showed when they were available. I was able to pull in Paul and say, Paul, we're paying you a full-time salary, and you've indicated here 14 hours you're available for. And laugh with him about the fact that he did that, and get him to rethink it and give me nearly 30 hours. Now, I'm not going to fill the 30 hours because he had lots of other duties as well, but it gave me flexibility. But if I'd gone, Paul, I need 28 hours out of you now, it wouldn't have worked. But by going in and laughing about it and listening to him explain why he'd just given me 14 hours, and could you push it up a little bit and think of some more times you've got available, worked. Scheduling the law school was my burden, as I say, for 10 years. I was really sorry when they got computers to do it, because I always still think to this day I was better than the computer, because I knew the staff, because I listened to them. Press for Change, which is the organisation we set up in 1992 to seek respect and equality for all trans people, was really only 6 people sat in their bedrooms at very old Amstrad computers initially. I sometimes think in many ways, it was always 6 people sat in their bedrooms at rather tacky old Microsoft computers in the end. But it achieved great things because what it did, those 6 people realised very early on that the only way we could have a mandate for this community was by listening to the community. What were their issues? What were their needs? We did research, we did surveys, we had focus groups, we had working days, we had all sorts of things where we listened to the community, but we also got them to listen to each other. And we discovered all sorts of things about the trans community that nowadays I think people have forgotten. One of the things that we learnt was that most trans people go on a pathway. They don't start out going, I'm trans. Unlike me. At 18, I went, hold on a minute, I want a sex change. You know, that's what I want, full stop. You know, that's where I'm heading, that's where I'm aiming. Most people are much slower. They take a bit more time. They go, I don't know what I am. Maybe I'm just a cross-dresser. Maybe I can do that. Maybe, you know, an awful lot of people get married in whichever gender, you know, whichever gender they are assigned at birth. Quite a lot of people do in both ways because they think that somehow they can be more normal. They forget that the reason, one of the main reasons they get married initially is because of the desire for the opposite sex, literally. You know, trans men find they desire cis men because they spend all their lives looking at them and wondering how to be one. Trans women spend all their lives looking at cis women, wondering how they can be one, and then they fall in love with one, and then they say, God, this is complicated. And we learned that people go on a pathway, and that, you know, people talk nowadays negatively often about the transgender umbrella, but it's real. Because the person who starts off there as an apparent cross-dresser or a butch lesbian or whatever else, 5 years later you find them over here having transitioned often. And if we didn't include them all in what we were seeking, we were going to leave people behind. And we were not going to leave people behind. We made a commitment, absolutely, never to leave anybody behind. So Press for Change, to even exist, we had to listen to each other. We started off with a whole set of things about listening, but also we had rule number 7, which was a wonderful rule. We work by making friends, not by making enemies. And that was, until we closed really in 2015-16, that rule was always there. We started off, one of our first making friends, awful out of focus picture, but it was actually at the 1997 Labour Party conference, just after the election, when we saw Michael Portillo shifted off onto the trains in his fancy outfits, and we saw Tony Blair, okay, come into power. But it was that glorious year when we felt like things were going to change, unlike this year where we feel like things are going to carry on a little bit as normal, but maybe get better in the end. So somebody bought us a stall. Somebody paid £3,000 for Press for Change to have a stall at the Labour Party conference. Absolute surprise, never found out who did it, but we set out, we had about 2 weeks, we made notices, we got people to donate photographs, did all sorts of things. And this is Alex Winham, who used to be CEO for Greater Manchester Community Voluntary Organisations. There, Christine Burns, who's written several books on the history of trans activism here, Mo Molam, and Bernadette, who had blue teeth with zirconiums in them. And you've got blue teeth with zirconium, she said. Yes, I always wanted them, and when I transitioned, I decided to get my teeth done at the same time, and I thought, God damn you, girl, right on, you know. And we worked by making friends and not by making enemies, I say, right until the bitter end. I'm going to come back to this picture at the very, very end, and Claire keeps indicating I'm not speaking into the microphone properly, so I'll shout a lot. I can't do this, you know, difficult. So, sometimes you've got to find the funny side. You know, in 1999, the Department of Work and Pensions put out a consultation document in which they wanted to restrict the rights that we'd won at the European Court of Justice. And included in that was the idea that people who transitioned in the workplace would be allowed to use the toilets of their new gender, provided a senior manager thought they looked reasonable enough. Now, you know, reasonable enough has always been one of the sort of... I look around the room and I think, dear God help us, how many of these would get through? This cartoon that somebody drew, which had the bucket between the toilets, was a massive, massive, massive impact on us working towards stopping this. It just made people realise how ludicrous the idea was. You know, and we always said, you know, you get people now, even now, say, oh, well, you know, you can always use the disabled toilets, and you say, those are for disabled people, you know, and if we start using the loos, you'll have to make some extras, you know, and who's going to do that? So, sometimes, finding the funny side has always, well, I've always felt it's been one of the most important things. If I can't learn to laugh at myself, and learn to, you know, enjoy the situation we're in. I do a lot of work still in the asylum courts with asylum seekers who are on appeals. And getting them to laugh before we go into court, before they have to tell their story, is really important to give them a sense that they have value, that their story is worthwhile. So, you know, in that process of listening, and this was one of the events where about 10 years ago, I regularly taught in Hong Kong over the last 30 years, and I was asked by the Hong Kong Equalities and Human Rights Commission to go and speak about family values because they were promoting the idea of same-sex marriage. And there was this chap there who kept appearing and saying, we don't want our children to know about this sort of stuff. And, you know, about the fourth event, I finally said to him, how old are your children? He said, I've got a 7-year-old, a 9-year-old, and an 11-year-old. And I said, because we had similar, you know, and I said, and do they have a smartphone? And he said, well, of course, because I knew in Hong Kong, every kid gets a smartphone for about 3. You know, you see them walking down the street, you know, going to a reception class with a smartphone in their hand. He said, well, of course they have. And I said, well, I think you're probably too late to stop your children knowing about this. But he still kept turning up, still having the same arguments on about so it's about the fourth meeting when he went on and on about the value of family and how important families were. And I actually really believe in family values. I've raised a family of 4, and I believe families take all sorts of forms. You know, I went to Geneva once to speak at the Human Rights Commission. There was a family there which consisted of 2 women who had adopted 21 children, right, in South Africa, in the northern region of South Africa, where AIDS had absolutely decimated the community. These were not even a couple, but they'd adopted 21 children, but because they weren't a couple, they didn't qualify for school benefits for the kids. You know, so it was like, how do we deal with that sort of issue in the middle of all this? I'm a great believer that families can be terrible, but they can also be wonderful. Anyway, it goes on about families. So finally, on the 4th occasion, I run up the stairs, I grab his hand, I shake it, and I say, I'm so glad that somebody else believes in families. And he looks at me. I say, well, you know, our 4 children, unless you've got a conversation. 3 months later, he closed down the Hong Kong Family Values Association and supported same-sex marriage. By having... So often it is about finding agreement with people. How do you find the points of agreement? When we were doing the Gender Recognition Act in 2003-4, all sorts of questions were sort of key on government ministers' minds. Should they insist that people had all sorts of surgery before they got gender recognition? It's rather appropriate today while the Supreme Court is addressing this very question. Should we demand sterilisation like many other countries do? What about sport? Should these people be able to play sport? And should we recognise people who come in from other countries? All of those we reached agreement on, sorts of compromises. We got rid of sterilisation, that's eugenics. We said surgery, well, what about people with disabilities or chronic conditions? You know, you could kill them on the table, that went. Sport, we got a negotiated agreement about an overseas recognition again. And then it came to same-sex marriage. We had a whole pile of older trans women who were still married to their partners, their wives. Interestingly, many of them had been former public, you know, leaders. They had done the classic, hide myself at school by becoming captain of the rugger team, move on to the army or the navy. I mean, Christ almighty, one of the people we worked with used to be Rear Vice Admiral in the Navy, and the Navy purser and was formerly the commander of the Royal Yacht Britannia. You know, this was the sort of route that people used to take. It used to be called the flight into hypermasculinity. Hide myself completely by appearing to be so masculine. And they often got married and had children, and when they transitioned, in many cases, they'd stayed together as couples. They were effectively same-sex married couples in their local communities. They were all accepted. I used to call them the Blue Ridge Brigade, for which they'd clip me around the ear roll. But Tony Blair was quite clear that he did not want same-sex marriage by the back door. That was the instruction from Downing Street. Stonewall was saying marriage or nothing else. And we were sort of sat in the middle of in the Department of Constitutional Affairs going, oh, fuck, you know. For 3 days, myself and Claire McNabb ran between various offices in order to say, can we reach compromise? And we proposed something like the French Pax, Civil Partnership Act. And the deal we got eventually was that the Civil Partnership Act would follow the Gender Recognition Act by 6 months, with special provision for these couples to end their marriage and get a civil partnership all in the same day, so that their pension benefits, actually the most important bit, the survivor pension benefits carried on. Because that was the thing that if they had to divorce, their wives who'd stood by them through thick and thin, even through gender reassignment in the end. You know, they'd often followed them around the world on army postings and things like that. They were going to lose all their survivor pension benefits if same-sex marriage hadn't been allowed, or something like, because they weren't going to get divorced. You know, one partner was saying, we must divorce, generally the wife saying, we must divorce because I don't want you to lose out being a woman, and the trans partner saying, of course we're not going to get divorced, you know, because I'm not going to lose that survivor pension benefit. We got to a compromise. So learning to listen to both sides is really important. One of the things I finally want to really discuss is, can we discuss hate? Can we really discuss hate and what it means? There are now 27 organisations in this country alone that are anti-trans. They've grown up in 8 years. It's a nightmare. Oh, you wanted a photograph of that? I'll go back if you'd like the photograph so you can find it. These are nightmares. Some of them are a few people, some of them have got big money, you know, and we're sort of stuck on the other side. There are things I am really willing to debate, things that are really important. Those include the fact that They say that trans women enable dangerous predatory men. Let's look at the facts. I can research that. I can show you what the evidence is. You show me your evidence. We'll actually have a conversation. Are trans women eroding single-sex rights? Well, there's a question about that. Let's talk about what that means in reality. And women have a right to freely speak and criticise what they call gender identity ideology. Of course, they've got a right to say anything they like. You know, of course they can discuss this. But there are things that are completely non-negotiable. They say biological sex is real, gender is an imagined social construct. Let me talk about how language is formed. You know, it's not anything that's for negotiation. They say trans medicine means seriously mentally ill people are given this extreme gender reassignment. Well, you know, I reckon most of us got a little spot in our brain that isn't quite like other people's. But, you know, if what it means is you get on with life as well as having gender reassignment, what does it matter? What does it matter to anybody else? And they say legal gender recognition is a fiction, worse it is a lie. No, it's not. It's actually real. What Parliament says, I'm not discussing those things. They are non-discussable. I can't persuade anybody about any of those things because I can't give you the evidence. I can't work out the evidence. But I can discuss the other things because those are real. So sometimes you have to say, that I can do, that I can't do. And I've often said, you know, people come to me and say, will you discuss this? And I go, I can't discuss it. I can't have a public conversation because I have nothing to say. So adapting to those critics that we see, you know, from the, as I say, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, right through to what we call now sex realists, or they call themselves sex realists, they fundamentally say, you know, all of them, you can't change the material reality of sex. Well, I never said you could. Did anybody ever say you could change the material reality of sex? But we can discuss gender and where that sits in society. So I will engage with, you know, in public, say some of the things you get on Twitter. What you describe is almost the definite example of a delusion. It may be delusional to be trans, but it doesn't really matter if the person does whatever they do and then gets on with life. You know, you can't cure the delusion. There's nowhere in the medical stuff has there ever been the delusion sort of resolved. Nobody's ever managed to do it. So it's a minor delusion that happily we can deal with nowadays in a positive way. I'll talk to you about that. Right? You don't change your sex. Well, I'll talk to you about that. I used to actually believe this was quite a sort of clear one. Do I change my sex? Well, my sex is... I've actually had my chromosomes tested. They are XY, you know, full stop. And then I read a paper about 2 months ago which said that they had found, on examining when trans men have vaginectomies, they were doing, you know, examining the cell structures and discovered that they'd changed, some of them had changed into prostate cells. And I thought, Christ, I've been on testosterone 50 years, mine must be an entire prostate. Perhaps I ought to, when they ask me if I need a PSA test, instead of saying I don't have a prostate, I have an unusually shaped one. Yeah. So these are things that we can discuss. And then you get people like Joyce, and this was interesting, you see, because they'd never said, this was only recently, she said at a conference, this is the real importance of the UK's ban on puberty blockers. They're not really a serious treatment option in the UK. I don't think more than hundreds of kids have taken them, certainly no more than a few thousand. It's about 1,400 in 20 odd years. So it's not a lot. And she said, what they are is a rhetorical and argumentative device. And you went, yes, got you. Because actually what you're doing is not discussing kids. You're discussing your personal political viewpoint. That is non-evidence. You might as well be discussing Christianity. She's an atheist, in fact, but you might as well be discussing Christianity or Buddha or Judaism with me, because I'm happy to listen, I'm happy to be there, but I can't believe in the magic. It's as simple as that. You know, it's exactly the same issues. So I have red lines. The minute somebody says that anybody's a paedophile or a kiddie groomer, they go in the block list. So full stop. I can't discuss anything with you. You're undiscussable. I put this in towards the end because this was really, I was a Girl Guide. I was a Queen's Guide. I made it all the way to a Queen's Guide and became part of the Lord Mayor's troop. I also became a Boy Scout leader later. And I made a promise that on my honour I promised to do my best. I used to talk to the kids about duty to God being, well, at least put your mind to the question. Duty to the Queen, well, it's exactly the same as serving the old lady down the road, you know. If you found the Queen struggling to cross the road, you'd do the right thing to help other people and to keep the law. That I took really seriously when I was a kid. I took it really seriously when I was an adult, that I will do my best. So I never walk into court or into any negotiation or into a meeting without being prepped and ready to listen to what the other side is saying or what the contributions are that people make. I know who I can speak to. There are people who are agenda owners but who are willing to learn. That includes people in Parliament, trans people there, because they always have an agenda. There are the technically neutral without an agenda, public servants, civil servants, police officers, the civil and criminal justice system. I can speak to all of those in their different ways because I have an agenda, I understand agendas, but I can't defend bigotry. And that's why I want to come back to this. Julie Bindel was my good friend for 25 years. As academics, we'd originally met, and we used to have lunch and laugh about everybody being non-binary. So, well, isn't everybody non-binary? You know, twice a year we'd have lunch and we'd laugh about the communities we lived and worked in. But typical of today, this is her on the Daily Mail, trans extremism has been so effective in bullying individuals and institutions into holding the official view that trans women are women. Trans extremism effective in bullying? Nobody bullied anybody. They always say it's Stonewall instead. They always say trans extremism, especially Stonewall. Stonewall had fuck all to do with it, you know. In fact, Stonewall stood, even in the Equality Act, Ben Summerskill, who was the CEO of Stonewall, sat in a parliamentary committee and said, gay men don't suffer from discrimination, so we don't need it to be included in the Act. And the rest of the panel goes, we'll speak up on their behalf, it's all right, you know. And she went, a child as young as 6 months can differentiate between the sexes. Well, A, it's wrong. It's somewhere between 18 months and 3 years. And yes, they can, because at 2, apparently, you know, my dad was looking at me and seeking advice because he knew that one day I was going to be a boy. When I told him at 18, he said, so, what's new? Been waiting for this. You know, simple as that. Maybe, you know, Julie Bindel is no longer my friend. I can't speak to her. I'd probably spit in her eye, to be honest, because the betrayal has been awful. But she said it, I've listened, and I've been betrayed. So I know where my lines are and who I will speak to. And ultimately, you know, my life is non-negotiable. As a trans person, my life is completely non-negotiable. But I will always listen and discuss whenever possible, except for bigotry. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Look at